We will strive not just for a pragmatic solution.
Possibility of going down in history.
Henry Kissinger, legendary diplomat and foreign policy scholar, dies at 100.
I was kind of a refugee who had to earn a living.
Henry Kissinger, one of the country's most important foreign policy thinkers for more than half a century, has died at the age of 100.
I have to say, I have never dealt with a group of people as treacherous as the North Vietnamese leadership.
He died on Wednesday at his home in Connecticut, according to a statement from his consulting firm, Kissinger Associates, Inc. A cause of death was not provided.
Once in a while, something happens in diplomacy.
As a Secretary of State and National Security Advisor to Presidents Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, Kissinger played the major behind-the-scenes role in building the architecture that enabled more manageable relations with the Soviet Union, China, and major Arab nations.
I know all of you will want to hear from the new Secretary of State.
At the same time, he was closely associated with some of the most controversial U.S. foreign policy moves in recent decades by promoting intensive bombing campaigns in Southeast Asia and repeatedly turning a blind eye to human rights abuses by governments perceived to be supportive of U.S. interests. Though he never worked directly under a U.S. president again after Ford left office, Kissinger's achievements were long-lasting. U.S. superpower relations to this day still bear his imprint, and he remained a sought-after voice on international affairs to the end of his life. Kissinger was the leading scholar practitioner of the post-World War II era, said Richard Haas, President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations. There were other great secretaries of state and a long list of impressive historians, but no one who combined the two pursuits as Kissinger did. Having arrived as a teenage refugee from Nazi Germany, Kissinger never lost the thick German accent, and his pronouncements on foreign policy challenges, delivered in a gruff baritone voice, made him a global celebrity. I remember walking down the street in Manhattan with him, and he would attract a crowd like a movie star, a rock star, recalled David Rothkopf, who worked for a time as a managing director at Kissinger's consulting firm. Everybody, regardless of what they thought of Henry, wanted to see Henry, wanted to be with Henry. As a superstar ex-diplomat, Kissinger was feted around the world, including in Germany, the land from which he fled with his family in 1938. Hitler at that point had been in power for 5 years, and during that time, the Kissingers, like other Jews, suffered Nazi persecution. Kissinger once told an interviewer that, growing up in Germany, he would cross the street whenever he saw a group of boys coming his way because he knew he was likely to be beaten up. In America, the young Kissinger worked in a factory during the day and went to school at night until he was drafted into the U.S. Army. Sent to Germany, Private Kissinger was among the American soldiers who liberated starving Jewish prisoners at a concentration camp in Ahlem. He met some of them again 60 years later when he spoke at the screening of a documentary film about Ahlem with many camp survivors present. There's nothing I'm more proud of than having been one of who had the honor of liberating the Ahlem concentration camp, Kissinger said in an uncharacteristically emotional speech. Noting how often he spoke to various groups, Kissinger told the Ahlem survivors that there was no one who meant more to him than those who showed up for the event. In that speech, Kissinger dismissed the notion that the harassment he faced as a teenager in Nazi Germany had traumatized him. That's nonsense, he said. They were not yet killing people. A traumatic event was to see Ahlem. It was the single most shocking experience I have ever had. His experience with the US military in Germany made Kissinger a believer in the idea of peace through strength. After getting out of the army, he attended Harvard. His 300-page undergraduate thesis was titled The Meaning of History. He went on to teach at Harvard, becoming known for his hawkish views. Kissinger's writings brought him to the attention of Richard Nixon, who made Kissinger his national security advisor. Over the next few years, he directed one of the boldest periods of diplomacy in U.S. history. In 1971, Kissinger arranged Nixon's historic visit to China. Thinking strategically, Nixon and Kissinger saw the opening to China as a way to challenge the Soviet Union, China's communist rival. Before that visit, no U.S. leader had dared to make an overture to Red China, as it was then called. After the visit, no U.S. leader dared to question the wisdom of the move. In Kissinger's view, it made sense to meet with brutal dictators if there were important issues to discuss. In a conversation at Harvard in 2012, he cited his dealing with Mao Zedong, Communist China's legendary but murderous leader. Chairman Mao caused unspeakable suffering, Kissinger acknowledged. It's an indisputable fact. But it was also a fact that he was a considerable strategic thinker in foreign policy. During the time of the opening to China, Kissinger was also meeting with Soviet leaders in Moscow. For more than 40 years, the specter of a nuclear confrontation had hung over the two superpowers. Kissinger's diplomacy ushered in a new period of tense dialogue and arms control agreements and helped diffuse the persistent and dangerous tensions between Washington and Moscow. And then there was Vietnam, where the limits of Kissinger's abilities became evident. Nixon sent Kissinger to Paris to negotiate a peace agreement. After 3.5 years of on-again, off-again talks with his North Vietnamese counterparts, Lee Duc-tho, Kissinger made a dramatic announcement in October 1972 that he would live to regret. "We believe that peace is at hand," he said. "We believe that an agreement is in sight." Kissinger and Lee Duc-tho won the 1973 Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts, but their agreements did not end the war. No foreign policy advisor to a US president before or since had the power Kissinger had. He spoke to Nixon as much as a dozen times a day. Kissinger saw Nixon as an insecure man, and tapes of White House phone conversations show how he catered to Nixon's emotional needs. "Mr. President," Kissinger told Nixon, following an April 1971 presidential address on the Vietnam War, "that was the best speech you've delivered since you've been in office." When Nixon demurred, Kissinger pressed his point. "It was a powerful speech," he insisted, "really movingly delivered." Kissinger traveled consistently, engaging directly with world leaders on matters of war and peace. His frantic search for an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict gave rise to the term shuttle diplomacy. Though not possessed with movie star looks, Kissinger had a brilliant intellect and a razor-sharp wit. And as a divorced man, he dated glamorous women, leaving him exposed to Nixon's teasing. "Henry, where are you?" Nixon scolded him in one phone call. "Just let me say that as soon as you take care of the ladies, if you could work into your schedule, I want you to get back here to the White House." Before long, Nixon was mired in the Watergate scandal, preoccupied with political crisis. He essentially let Kissinger take charge of foreign policy making. That worked for Nixon, said Rothkopf, the Kissinger aide and later the author of a book on national security advisors. Because Nixon didn't want to interact with people so much, he was a little paranoid. And then when he went into the crisis years, Kissinger essentially became deputy president for foreign policy. In 1973, Nixon made Kissinger his Secretary of State, while keeping him as his national security advisor. When Gerald Ford took over after Nixon's resignation in 1974, he retained Kissinger as Secretary of State, though not as National Security Advisor. In fact, Kissinger had already made his mark. The hard-nosed foreign policy approach he advocated was associated more with Kissinger himself than with the presidents under whom he served. Indeed, his promotion of detente with Moscow was later criticized by some conservatives in his own Republican Party. Kissinger's guiding principle was that US national interests take precedence over more idealistic aims like the promotion of democracy and human rights. "I used to say more to my colleagues," Kissinger told in an interview in 2007, "We're a country, not a foundation. We have to conduct foreign policy for America." With that unwavering commitment, Kissinger advocated bombing campaigns in Vietnam and Cambodia to strengthen the US negotiating position. He was comfortable with the US giving green light to the dirty war in Argentina and to Indonesia's invasion to East Timor because those governments were US allies. Likewise, the US could welcome a coup against Salvador, the elected socialist president in Chile. Kissinger's detractors said his identification with such policy decisions meant he was liable for war crimes. At public events like his 2012 appearance at Harvard, accusations were inevitable. How do you justify receiving the Nobel Peace Prize when you were the architect of, with Richard Nixon, of killing 4 million Southeast Asians during the Vietnam War? One audience member asked, going on to highlight the death of East Timorese and the coup in Chile, which resulted in the death of thousands of Chileans. "Do you deny these war crimes?" the man said. Basically, how do you sleep with yourself at night? Kissinger was accustomed to such questions and regularly encouraged his critics to consider the big picture. Just study who did what, not people who live off providing their country is evil and their leaders are criminal, Kissinger told a Harvard questionnaire. Start from the assumption that rational people were in government. What led to what decision? He urged his critic to go through the minutes of a national security meeting. You may not agree with it, he said, but you won't throw around words like war criminal then. Kissinger knew something about criminal leaders from his own experience in Nazi Germany, but it did not keep him from engaging with other governments that executed their opponents. It may have been that Kissinger's own life experience made it easier for him to be dispassionate about tough policy choices. Henry Kissinger, legendary diplomat, last words before he died. We are all alone, born alone, die alone, and we shall all someday look back on our lives and see that, in spite of our company, we were alone the whole way. I do not say lonely, at least not all the time, but essentially and finally alone. This is what makes your self-respect so important, and I don't see how you can respect yourself if you must look into the hearts and minds of others for your happiness. When people don't express themselves, they die one piece at a time.